I've seen way too many people go after the cheapest 1080p panel they can find, only to end up wishing they'd spent a little more when the colors look flat, the motion looks choppy, and the HDR claims turn out to be just a marketing line. That regret hits hard because the upgrade cost later feels like a wasted penny. So the question I keep hearing is, does dropping a few $100s on a premium display actually protect you from that disappointment, or are you just paying for hype? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When I first pulled the BenQ MOBIUZ EX271UZ out of the box, the first thing I noticed wasn't the glossy logo or the sleek stand, it was the sheer weight of the panel and the way the screen seemed to swallow the room's ambient light. That's the kind of presence you only get with an OLED-based display, and it set the tone for what the rest of the review would focus on: real-world experience versus the glossy spec sheet. Let's start with the obvious selling point, a 27-inch 4K QD-OLED panel that can push 240 Hz at a 0.03 milliseconds response time. In theory, that sounds like a dream for both competitive shooters and cinematic gamers. I ran a couple of my go-to titles **Valorant** on PC, Halo Infinite on Xbox Series X, and a recent 4K movie on a streaming stick to see how the monitor behaved under typical daily use. In fast-paced shooters, the 240 Hz refresh made a noticeable difference. The mouse cursor glided smoothly, and the ultra-low response time meant there was essentially no ghosting when I flicked across the screen. What mattered most was the consistency. The monitor held the high frame rate without stuttering, which is a relief if you've ever tried to squeeze 240 Hz out of a less capable panel and ended up with a jittery experience. For console gamers, the picture stayed crisp at 4K 120 Hz, and the FreeSync Premium Pro worked flawlessly with the Xbox's variable refresh, keeping the action fluid without the flicker you sometimes see on cheaper HDMI-only models. Color accuracy was the next surprise. BenQ's spectral color and pixel contrast tuning really shines when you're editing photos or watching a color-graded film. The panel covers 99% of the DCI-P3 gamut, and the 10-bit output gives you gradients that don't band out even in the darkest shadows. I tested a few HDR clips, and while the DisplayHDR 400 certification doesn't push the brightness into the cinema-grade range, the true black label is accurate. The blacks are genuinely deep, which makes the brighter highlights feel more punchy. In practice, you get a vivid, lifelike image for games, but you won't be hitting the 1000 nit peaks you see on premium HDR TVs. If you're looking for the absolute brightest HDR experience, you'll notice the difference, but for most gamers and creators the contrast and color depth are more than sufficient. One of the less talked about conveniences is the built-in USB-C port delivering 90W of power. I plugged my laptop into the monitor, and it not only sent video but also charged the device fully while I worked. That eliminated a tangled mess of cables on my desk, and the monitor's remote controller made quick tweaks easy without having to reach for a button on the back. The Color Shuttle Game Art database provides over 120 preset profiles, which you can cycle through for different game genres: racing, FPS, RPG, so you get a tailored look without diving into menus. Now, the trade-offs. The first thing most people will balk at is the price. This isn't a budget monitor, it sits in the high-end segment where you're paying for the OLED technology and the 240 Hz panel. That means you need a relatively powerful GPU to actually feed 4K at 240 Hz in modern games. If you're still on a mid-range card, you'll probably be capping at 144 Hz or dropping down to 1440p, which undercuts part of the selling point. That's a hidden cost. You might end up upgrading your graphics card sooner than you planned. Burn-in is a perennial concern with OLED displays, especially for static UI elements like HUDs in games or taskbars when you use the monitor as a workstation. BenQ tries to address that with a 3-year OLED burn-in warranty, which is reassuring, but the risk isn't eliminated. In my tests, the built-in pixel shift feature moved the image subtly every few minutes, which helped, but if you're the type who leaves a game paused on a static screen for hours, you should be aware that a faint ghost could develop over time. For most users who have a habit of changing content regularly, the risk stays low, but it's a factor that cheap alternatives simply don't have to worry about. Another practical limitation is the HDR brightness ceiling. DisplayHDR 400 means the peak luminance tops out around 400 nits. That's great for delivering true blacks and decent highlights, but it won't compete with the 1000 plus nit HDR you see on premium TVs or even some high-end gaming monitors. If you're a creator who relies on bright, specular highlights for visual effects work, you might find